Welcome to 101. I'm Greg Bassett, your host from the Salisbury Independent newspaper. It's a big day here at PAC 14. They're all big, but this is a big one. We have my friend in the house, Marilyn Buerkle. Welcome.
Thank you, Greg.
Now, you're on the faculty at UMES, and
I am.
you are very involved in media. You've been a hero of mine since I was a teenager in high school, watching you on television on WBUC.
Careful how much you age me.
Exactly, I have to be careful. But tell me about your work at UMES and what's going on in Marilyn Buerkle's life right now.
Well, I am a member of the Department of English and Modern Languages, which is a very broad umbrella that includes media courses. And so when I transitioned from television work to academia, we had a handful of media-related classes, and those I taught whatever there was. Now, we are very proud that starting this fall, we will begin the first class of digital media majors.
Wow.
We're still part of the English department, and I think that's an excellent connection because, as you know, when you're helping young people become great reporters, that one thing you lament, I don't know, I'm speaking for you, one thing I lament is the lack of attention to writing skills.
Right.
And so presumably, coming out of the English department, they will, in addition to understanding how to operate a camera or how to edit audio or how to conduct an interview, they'll also be able to write a sentence with correct grammar and sentence structure. Yay. But we've worked a number of years on this new major, and I'm of the opinion of the if you build it, they will come.
Right.
And I believe it will be an excellent recruitment tool. We probably 3 years ago, the state invested heavily in our campus in an engineering and aviation science complex. And while it seems a little weird that an English department faculty member would be housed in the engineering and aviation science complex, the truth is the university worked to get many, not all, but many of the degrees that involve technology in one way or another into the same building. Well, when that happened, in advance of a major, we got the world's greatest television studio. We have, our student radio station is this really fabulous, fabulously equipped facility in a glass box in a common area so students can watch what's happening. And then upstairs in that building we have 3 television studios, 1 great big deluxe studio, and then 2 what we call practice studios, where students can work individually on projects. We have an audio production room where we do podcasts. We have 5 video edit suites, 5 audio edit suites, really nice offices with a great view. So we have been functioning with this great stuff, but our students didn't get that last bit, the credential.
Right.
So that when they go out and hand out a resume, I hope that you and I, as hiring people in media organizations, would have said, English degree, great, they can write. But in fact, not everybody says that. And people are thinking more like, how much studio time have you had? What productions have you been involved in? And so our students will now be able to present a resume that says, digital media, bachelor degree holder. So that begins in the fall. And we actually already have 3 people who have changed their major to digital media, freshmen who arrived and got wind of it.
Right.
So I'm starting out with 3 already there. The rest of my life is involved in supervising interns. I do in the interest of keeping my hand in journalism, I do a monthly newsletter for our department. And then we are part of the School of Education, Social Science, and the Arts. And I do a magazine for CESA twice a year. So I stay busy.
That's great. That really is great. And you mentioned the writing. It's one of the things I noticed, as a news guy, watching television news, is that they don't seem to know how to tell a story with their words. They let the pictures tell the story, which is all fine. But there used to be some great writing in TV reporting where the reporter could tell the story, and I just feel like that's missing now.
I agree to a certain extent that writing is a junior member of the team next to the pictures.
Right.
I do think pictures can tell a story in a way, and so can sound, in a way that words might not capture, because you get, think of a hurricane, you get the sense of being there. Here's what it sounded like, here's what it felt like. I can remember Steve Hammond doing a story about a chicken house fire and saying, boy, if this was smell-o-vision, because it's that sensory
Right.
approach that video and audio can give you. I'm not going to say all great writing has gone away, but I do agree. But I think that's the part of the medium. I mean, I don't think people should, I've never thought people should have one single news source. And so a television story in a minute and a half can't give you the sort of detail and background that a number of column inches can. And I think people ought to watch television to get the sense of what it feels like, and then go to a newspaper or a website and read in depth the kind of information that they're not going to get in that short story. It's a combination of being well informed, not a singular focus.
So you were reporter anchor at BOC, WBOC here in town in the late 1970s. Then you went to Washington, worked for Storer Communications, which was the big Comcast of its time, doing Washington reporting. Then you were at C-SPAN, which I'm a C-SPAN guy, love C-SPAN. And then you came back to WBOC and you were the news director there for a long time, and now down at UMES. So you talk about telling a story, so this is where I'm headed with this.
Do you want me to tell the Marilyn Buerkle story?
No, I feel like you mentored one of the great storytellers of all time, a guy who did it with very few words. Scorchy Tawes could tell a story.
You know, when you were talking about great writing, I was going to mention Scorchy, and then I thought maybe you didn't agree with me, but he absolutely was a fabulous storyteller. We were rookies together. When I was a beginning reporter at WBOC, I started actually as a on-air disc jockey at WBOC AM, and I was late night. I went on at, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 in the evening, and then signed off the station when stations used to sign off.
Right.
And I was, I think, perhaps, the first woman DJ full-time, certainly the first one at BOC. And I remember someone telling me later that when my resume came in, and it was unusual to get a resume from a female, one of the people who hired me said to someone else, I guess we're about ready to hire a woman. Okie dokie. I was ready to be a DJ. But when I moved into the television newsroom, about a year after I'd been there, Scorchy was just being hired as, he did a fishing report that was sponsored by Peninsula Bank.
Right.
And so he was on maybe, I think once a week, and then it was twice a week. But the deal was our weather guy, Ralph Pennywell, and Scorchy were like Mutt and Jeff, Laurel and Hardy, Jerry Lewis, and, he played off Ralph in a way that was, I think, amusing to the audience, and a whole lot different than the weather fashions for Benjamins. So it became clear that Scorchy was the kind of personality that we could connect really well with our audience, and that grew into Fishing Report and then Scorchy's Corner. And so he was learning to do that stuff while I was learning to do that stuff, and so that was a lot of fun.
Scorchy would come on with a fishing coat on. And
his red jacket.
Yeah, and he was to stand there at the weather map, and he would draw things, and you couldn't see it because his body was blocking it, and it was just like, it was just so comical.
We had like shoe polish things on a plastic grid. There were no graphics like that, and no animation. I mean, not because we didn't have it. I don't think it existed.
Right.
We were in the dark ages of television. But the one thing I can say about weather is that one night, and it was a weeknight, so it must have been Ralph. Somebody got sick, like between the early shows and the late show, and it was like, okay, Marilyn, you got to do the weather. And I still know nothing about the weather and less about how to, because it's really tricky. You're pointing in a direction, it's almost like working at a mirror. It requires coordination.
Yeah.
My next door neighbor was an oceanographer, is an oceanographer. And I made him come to the studio, and he drew the map before the weather forecast.
Right.
And then he sat sort of below me where you couldn't see him on camera and sort of gesture at me. No, you want to be over here.
And Ralph was also on the radio in the afternoon.
Yes,
Yeah.
signed. He was on. I went on at 6
Yeah,
because
okay.
Ralph was on from 3 to 6. Our news was at 7, and I came on at 6. And then mostly what I did was ran the board for the Oriole games.
Right.
We didn't have much in the way of programming in the evening,
Right.
but there was a Salisbury City policeman who didn't. People were curious about what I looked like because on radio
And you had
didn't
great
know.
pipes. You had the best voice ever. Everyone wanted to know what Marilyn Buerkle looked like.
Well, this one policeman certainly did, and I made a joke on the air about something about who would have guessed that a 6-foot-tall redhead, and the policeman. I look out and there's a cop car right outside the studio, and he was demanding to come in and see that 6-foot-tall redhead. He was sorely disappointed when I said, no, Marilyn's not here.
Then you went to Washington, and you got to interview really big newsmakers.
You know, it's funny, the death of Pete DuPont recently brought back a very vivid memory. When I was still a reporter at WBOC, we didn't have a Dover bureau, and surely we covered Delaware news, and I drove the hour to Dover to interview Pete DuPont, and I can remember calling my mother that night and said, I talked to a real governor,
Yeah.
the governor of the state of Delaware. And my mother's like, Delaware. I was so excited. Then, when I went to graduate school in Washington, part of the master's thesis was for us was a journalism project, and I was working on a 3-part series about spouse abuse and whether or not there was a federal legislative role in protection of the victims of domestic abuse. And darn if it wasn't Joe Biden who was pushing that effort.
Yeah.
And I'm walking up, and there's all these reporters around the Judiciary Committee, and Joe comes out and he's like, Marilyn, what the heck are you doing here? So my local connections enabled me to get right in there to the newsmakers. But I can remember when Ronald Reagan was in the White House and Ed Meese was, it was
Attorney General.
Not when he was Attorney General.
Okay.
He worked in the White House. I don't know what his title was now. I can't think of it. But anyway, his office was, the Oval Office is here, and then there's this little tiny office off
Right.
to the side, and that was his office. And I remember doing an interview with Ed Meese in that office and thinking, this is pretty cool.
It is cool.
It really was.
Yeah.
And then also, I think we both can feel this way, whether it was a local story or a national story or an international story. Being in the room, at the place when things are happening. That's really our job, is to tell other people what it was like to be in the room. Here's what it sounded like. Here's what they said. These are the people who are angry about this. And so there are different memories. There was a anniversary march of the March on Washington, what I guess was maybe 20 years later. And many of the civil rights leaders who had been very active in the 60s were back in the 80s. That was, I really felt like I was at an important place.
Right.
When, now I'm not going to be able to say his name, the guy who was a management budget for Reagan,
David Stockman.
Thank you. Do you remember Stockman had to go to the woodshed?
Yes.
I was in the room when Reagan came out. I had never seen as many cameras and as many reporters squished into the briefing room as the day that David Stockman went to the woodshed.
Stockman basically went on TV and said that Reaganomics wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I did before I went to C-SPAN was I worked for Storer Communication. They were a big name in cable, but they also owned 7 television stations. And I was a Washington correspondent for their television stations. So Atlanta, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, Toledo, San Diego and Boston. And that allowed me to meet movers and shakers in those cities.
Right.
Because if their mayor came to lobby for something, or I particularly remember George Voinovich, who was mayor of Cleveland at the time, who then became a senator. You just met people who you knew really cared about the country and were anxious to do the right thing. Now, whatever the right thing is was surely different for a crowd of people.
Right.
But people who, and maybe this is trite, but people who dedicate their lives to public service, I think that's pretty impressive. And so in those situations where you knew what was happening was really going to matter to the country, that was really, you felt good about being there. The other time, I don't know if you remember the Air Florida crash on the 14th Street Bridge.
Yeah, Potomac River, yeah.
Yeah, that
Lenny
day.
Skutnik.
That day there was the plane crash, but there was also a subway accident, the metro,
Right.
and it was a snowstorm, and this was long before cell phones, and the administrative assistant in our office was mother hen to all of us and was a wonderful lady, and she was terrified because our engineer had to cross the bridge to get to the transmitter to uplink our stuff, so she knew he was on the bridge. I was in the subway on my way to another story, and all of that was happening at once. That was a noteworthy day. And then I also remember when there was a crazy guy at the Washington Monument.
Right, the guy who, the city had a
Car-
bomb and
yeah.
the van and all that, yeah.
And we were up on the roof of our building shooting across live shots for all these
He was
cities.
wearing the bulletproof clothes. Yeah.
That was
Yeah, it was scary.
Yeah, you're taking me down memory lane in ways that I hadn't remembered.
And we promised we weren't going to do a walk down memory lane.
Yeah,
so.
well, the C-SPAN stuff was, there you felt like you were making history. I mean, in the sense that...
Well, it was the beginning of C-SPAN.
Absolutely.
So you all were creating this thing that's so important to us. And like Brian Lamb, my hero, the kind of interviews that he does is exactly what I want to copy. And I always wanted to be like Brian Lamb because he would have a conversational thing. He was just very knowledgeable. And you must have learned so much. When I finally met Brian Lamb and I told him I was from Salisbury, his first thing he said was, "Do you know Marilyn Buerkle?" And when I said I did, it was like Brian Lamb and I were best friends as soon as I said that.
Well, I guess I should blush and say, I made such an impression on him. But the truth is, Brian Lamb, I mean, that's the most remarkable thing about Brian. He remembers everyone.
Yeah.
No kidding, everyone.
He cares so much.
Well, but he has this photographic memory
Yeah.
or facial recognition, I don't know. And the other thing was, forgive me, Brian, he never sweat. You know, the humidity in Washington is crazy. And it's, 95 degrees outside, and Brian's got a suit on, and he's starched perfectly, and he never dampened.
He never appeared on C-SPAN without being perfectly dressed.
He always looked great.
Yeah.
He allowed us, really, to invent or to take what he had invented. That was his baby. But he hired people that he let then make decisions.
Right.
And it was so much fun.
And it was fly-on-the-wall journalism.
Well,
It was never about you guys. It was always about what you were covering.
And actually, I think that when I made the transition from Storer to C-SPAN, Brian was a little hesitant because I was a TV news person.
Right.
And we weren't doing news in his mind. We were taking people into the room. What I especially loved when we used to, Brian's biggest compliment to me was we used to talk in to the House sessions. This was before the Senate was on TV. And when I say talk in, I mean they would be supposed to start at 1, and then there'd be something going on, and it'd be 101, 103, and you're still looking at the shot, and so the producers would...
You read the agenda.
Tell what was going to come.
Yeah.
And Brian once complimented me on my ability to fill that space. And I was like, oh yeah, that's my TV news experience doing
Right.
live shots. So sometimes it
Well,
comes in handy.
To me, it was like talking up a record. This is really minutia.
Exactly.
Talking up a record on the radio, because you see the speaker headed to the chair, and you'd cut it off right when the gavel went down. Like you were able to finish your sentence right when it was just amazing how you were able to sense the rhythm of what was going on the House floor to time your remarks.
Well, it also was part of that experience of having been a DJ.
Right.
Because you do talk the record.
Right.
Anyway, the thing that was most unique about C-SPAN for me was that we had an afternoon meeting, 3:30 every day, where we would decide what we were doing the next day. And you would get a briefing on these hearings are going on, this press conference is happening. But then there'd be somebody like, so what if we got a bus and went to all the state capitals and interviewed all the governors? Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Let's do that.
The C-SPAN school bus.
Yeah, well, in that case, it was the first campaign was called States of the Nation, and it was to literally go to every state and talk to every governor. However, it had an ulterior motive, and that was that not all cable systems were carrying C-SPAN at the moment. But boy, if your governor was going to be live on C-SPAN,
right,
that cable company, at least in the capital city,
right,
ought to be paying attention. So it was, I would never call Brian shrewd, but it was a wise move on his part.
One thing that's the unique in television, on C-SPAN, no host has ever been the first thing photographed.
Oh, you always start on the guest.
Yeah, you start on the guest or the Capitol Dome or whatever, but the host doesn't matter to the program. And just the idea, like, we're not going to make it about the host. We're not going to make it about Geraldo Rivera or, whoever the host is. It's going to be the issues. And it's just brilliant to me.
The folks who work there, I mean, that's a mission. That's their Bible. It is the most political junkie kind of atmosphere you can imagine.
Right.
And I love that. I thrived in it. And I probably would not necessarily have returned to Salisbury, but...
Right, so you break back into jail. You work to get out of Salisbury. You break back into jail, and you're the news director at WUC for 15 years?
13.
13 years.
It was... that was a hard transition, quite honestly. Partly because I came from a big team. I was a unit manager at C-SPAN, but I was not the boss. And then to walk into what should have been a familiar newsroom, but by then they were owned by a different company, and I wasn't sure what to expect. And it, the buck rested on my desk, and it was the first couple of years a pretty tough transition. But the fact that my husband was from Salisbury and didn't leave when I went to Washington, I commuted. It became clear to me that I better learn how to do this job well, because this was the job that was the right fit for me and my career goals and my personal life. And I took a great deal of pride in what we did, and we, I think, did a good job of covering the community and growing the audience. That was probably the biggest thing that Tom Draper brought to the company, the new owner, when I returned. His vision was that the people in Salisbury had far more in common with the people in Georgetown or Seaford or Dover than they did Baltimore or Annapolis. Or, that Delmarva was a region and should be treated as such for journalism purposes. And by the time I returned, they had already opened the Dover Bureau, and we had the kinds of, and I'll describe them as toys. What we were doing was serious business, but we had live trucks and we had enough staff to be lots of places. And I had great folks who worked with me who either were from the community or had put down roots and perhaps were going to stay in the community. When you mentioned about people who didn't expect to stay in Salisbury, I don't know about you at the Daily Times, but didn't you ever feel like a Yenta?
Oh, yeah.
Where you were looking for that great local person and you're going to introduce them?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that happened with Steve Hammond. That happened with Jackie Jennings.
Yeah, but I think you had probably the hardest job in town, because you hired, the anchors, the reporters, the videographers. You had, 6 shows a day to produce, morning, noon, 6, 7, 11. Now they have a lot more with more stations. And when you watch it, it's so repetitive. It's painful to even watch. But each broadcast was breaking news, I mean, throughout the day.
Well, I did feel like we had an enviable position in the market because we had been the only television station for so many years. I mean, when Mr. Truitt and Mr. Downing started the company in the, well, heck, they were radio long before, but when television went on the air in the early 50s, that was it. I mean, there was no cable to see any other television show anyplace else in the area, and we were the only game in town. So we had a lock on the audience for loyalty's sake, but it was also a great responsibility.
Right.
Because you knew if you didn't tell the community about this, they wouldn't know, unless they read the newspaper.
Right. And Mr. Truitt, of course, started the Daily Times, too. So, yeah. They're cutting me off for time here. I've got more to talk to you about.
Oh, wait, I have to tell one thing.
Can I get you to come back?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, well, we'll do that.
No, you want to do that or you want to tell it?
I want to tell one thing,
okay.
and that is that we're going to have a day camp at UMES this summer.
I had a little article in the paper about it.
For students who are interested in perhaps a career in TV production. It runs in July for a week, and it's for 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. And yes, it is a shameless way for us to intrigue people into becoming digital media majors at UMES, but it's also an awful lot of fun. And we'll be doing that. We couldn't last summer because of COVID.
Right.
So, okay, I snuck my little plug in.
But there's nothing more fun to me than television and news, and I don't know why more people aren't into it, but it's just so fun. The social media dominating everything makes no sense to me, but you still need people with some sort of authority to tell the stories that are going on and to separate the wheat from the chaff, I think.
The real from the fake?
Exactly. Marilyn Buerkle, thanks for being here today. We want to get you back if that's okay, because I want to talk more about WBOC and just
Sure.
what you see out there in terms of when you watch TV. I'm sure sometimes I wince. You must be beating your head into the pavement sometimes when you're watching TV.
Sometimes.
But thanks for being here today. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate the invitation.
I'm Greg Bassett from the Salisbury Independent Newspaper. Another edition of 101 right here on PAC 14.
First Shore Federal is proud to support PAC 14 and one-on-one. We'd encourage every business to support PAC 14 and pick a program and support it, and let's make a difference.